Now the pseudo classes are great when you have basic needs from your forms. But once you move into an area where you really need to give some fine-grained control, then that's the point at which you want to start introducing some scripts. Now this is basically the same form that we had before, except now what I'd like to do is give users a better understanding of what they need from the form. So without doing anything, I'm going to click on the validate button, and you can see that I have my required messages here. So username is required and email address is required. Okay, well, let's try to push this a little bit more. What if the username here, I just put in numbers? Okay, now I hit validate again. Well, the username must be a series of alpha characters only. Okay, so email address is required. But within emails, you can't have any special characters. So let's say I actually accidentally make a typo and I say me, hashmark, whatever.com. Now when I validate that, I get a message that says special characters are not allowed. So with the pseudo classes, it's basically an all or nothing. It's either valid or it's not. And you can provide some information to the user about how to correct the problem. But if you want to get really fine-grained about what the problems might be so that they can correct them as they go along, then you'll want to take a different approach than just using the pseudo classes. So the code for this is a little more involved, but this is because you need to have the different pieces in order for it to work right. The first thing that I'd like you to notice is that we have our input type, and it's a text type. This is the username. I have the same pattern applied to it. Max length required, all the same as the last demo. Underneath it though, instead of just having a single element that has the message that I need for it, I have a collection of rules that are applied to this item. So you notice here the username is required and the username must be a series of alpha characters only. And so as the script runs against this, we'll find out what kind of validation state the form is in. And if a validation rule is broken against this item, we'll be able to query the DOM and display the correct item to the user. So the same thing basically works for the email here. I have my email rules right next to the email element, and I've got the different messages that are here. So the key to this demo really is in the JavaScript that supports it. So I'll take this step by step so you have a good understanding of exactly what's going on. The first thing that I'm doing is I'm declaring a variable called rule names. And the purpose for this variable is to have a collection of rule names that I'll use to run against the form. So as we submit the form, the browser will decide whether or not it's at a valid state. But then after that, I can query each one of these elements to figure out which one of the validation rules is broken. And so what I'm doing is I'm pulling out my validation rules from the HTML. So I'm not repeating anything anywhere. So I'm not having to match up these elements with some magic strings that I have in the JavaScript down below. Right here with these class names, these are the rules that are run within the browser. So we have value missing, type mismatch, and in fact, before I go on, I've got a slide here that I'd like to show you that kind of dives into what each one of the validation rules are. The built-in validation rules that you'll find within the browsers are value missing, type mismatch, pattern mismatch, too long, range under and overflow, step mismatch, and valid. So value missing will return true if the required element is empty. So if we're requiring it, we need a value, well, it's true if the value is missing. Type mismatch applies to the new type attributes. For instance, if the type equals email and you type in text that resembles a URL, well, then you've encountered a type mismatch and this will return true. A pattern mismatch returns true when the regular expression pattern that you've applied to the input element doesn't match the input that the users put in. So when you've had a mismatch, this will return true based off of the regular expression. Too long will return true when the value that someone enters in surpasses the max length property that's been applied to the element. Range underflow and overflow will return true if the values within these input elements are outside of the bounds of your min and maximum attributes that are defined within the element. A step mismatch will return true if the value doesn't conform to the step value that you've placed within your range element. If the value that you have isn't possible based off of the step value that you have in there, then you'll get a step mismatch. And finally, valid returns true only if all of the above rules do not return true. So this is kind of backwards. All the other ones, if it returns true, it's something bad, but if valid returns true, then it's something good. So now that you have that familiarity, let's go back to the code and we can look at the different validation rules that I've applied within the validation messages. Now, once again, you'll see that the validation messages here have the validation rule injected into the class name. So the idea is that as I go through the DOM and take a look at the messages that I want to display, those will match up to validation rules that I want to run, and then it kind of makes a clean solution in order to figure out what I'm looking for within the form. So that's the rule names array. Then I'm using jQuery to run some code as soon as the page loads. The first thing that I'll do as the page loads, I'm looking for my validation messages. And if we come up here, you can see that each one of my messages here has the VMSG class applied to it. And also, just for trivia, I have this none here. And this is a class where the CSS is defined to not show it on the screen initially. That way, I'm only showing validation messages when I need to. So I'm finding all of the items on the page that have the VMSG class applied to them. And then once I find each one of those, then I'm taking a look at the class name, and then I'm splitting it up by space, and then I'm just taking the first one. So if I look at this class, I'll split all of this text up by the space, and then my index 0 item will be the rule that I'm looking for. And so now that I have that, I can load each one of those items into my rule names array, and so I have the validation rules that I need to run on the page. Next, I'm using jQuery to make a selection on the page to get all the input items that are not a button. Then I'm attaching some functions to the event handlers that will help me enforce validation. When this item is marked as invalid, then I'll run the validation fail function, and then I'll run my validate function every time I blur away from that input element. So after I've made some data entry and I go on to another element, the blur event will fire, and then I'll call validate. Finally, I just have a little button on the page that allows me to run validation rules without submitting the form. This is good when you download the code for just testing this code out here. The first thing that happens when I run the validate function is I want to begin by hiding all of my validation messages, because I'm just taking kind of a brute force approach here. I'm clearing out all the validation messages, and then once the form has been marked as invalid and I find out which validation rules have been broken, then I can show just the specific ones. So this helps as the user's going through the form, they only see the appropriate validation messages at a time. And then finally, as I call validate, I hide all those items, and then I call check validity on the selected form. And so as I'm checking the validity, it'll go through and run the validation rules applied to each one of the input elements. And then if I have a broken rule, then I'm in an invalid state. And if you'll remember that once I'm on an invalid state, on invalidate on each one of the input controls, then I'm calling validation fail. And validation fail is the function that allows me to display the appropriate message to the user. So within validation fail, it passes in an argument for me, and this argument allows me access to the source element. And so I'm setting that aside in the element variable. I can also get reference to the validation state off of this element, and so I've set that aside within this variable called validity. And then I also need to know the ID of the particular item that I'm looking for. Now, once I have all of that information, I can check to see if the validation state is valid or not. And so this tells me that the validation state of this form is invalid. And so at that point, what I can do is check to find out which one of the rules is broken. So all I'm doing here in order to do that is simply looping through my rule names. I have this array that has all the validation messages that I have for the form. So I loop through those, and then I have a function that allows me to check for that rule. And so I'll pass in the validation state, I'll pass in the selected rule name that I'm looking at, and also the ID of the element. That gets called for each one of the items in the array. And so when we go and check for check rule, I'm using an eval function here in order to glue together the rule name with validity. The idea here is that you can call this explicitly by looking at your validation state and saying validity.rulename. And if you remember, those are the rules that I showed you within the slides. And those will always return to you a Boolean value. For instance, if you're looking for a required value and there's no value there, then the value missing property will return true. This gives me a way to pass in each one of those rule names, glue it to the validity state, and find out whether or not it's true or not. That's why it's wrapped within this if condition to find out if each one of the rules that I have within the page, if those return true, then what I need to do is go in and show that message to the user. And that's made very simple by just using jQuery. And so I create a selector here where I'm looking for the ID rules. That's a convention I enforced in the markup here. So let's scroll back up to the markup for a moment. You can see here that the ID for the input element is username. And then right next to it, I have username rules. And so within that piece of script that I'm showing you right now, I'm making a selection against this element, and then I'm looking for any one of the child elements here that match the class name that I'm passing in based off of the validation rule. So I'm selecting the username rules, and I'll be looking for value missing. And once I find that item, I'll remove the none class. And again, all none does, when I take a look at the style sheet here, is that just sets the display equal to none. So it hides it from the page. So when I remove that class, it'll show it to the user. So that's exactly what I've done here. So I'm looking for an ID of the element ID, and then it's also being appended with the convention of the word rules. And then within that, I'm looking for a child element with the class name of whatever the rule name is. And then from there, I can remove the none class. So once again, let's see it in action. Here's the form. Refresh the page here. So I'm required to have an alpha-only username. So if I type in some numbers here, when I press the tab key or hit this validate button, what happens is it goes through all the validation rules applied to the form, and it matches up those validation rules based off of the name of the element, and then shows me the appropriate message based off of the broken rule. So now that you've had an opportunity to see how to work with built-in validation rules, in the next section, I'll show you how you can implement your own custom validation rules.